History is rarely shaped in the bright light of day. It's often written in the quiet, desperate hours of the night, in moments of sudden, catastrophic rupture. Today, in this explainer, we're looking at the story of a 158-year-old financial empire, an institution that survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression, only to be entirely undone by its own unchecked ambition. This is the story of how the heartbeat of the global financial system simply stopped, and the desperate, fiercely debated attempts to rebuild the machine in the aftermath. It's essential to understand the sheer finality of this moment. The exact time of death was 1:45 a.m., Monday, September 15, 2008. At that precise minute, Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in the United States, officially filed for bankruptcy. Employees, some carrying cardboard boxes with their personal belongings, walked out of their Manhattan headquarters and into the dark. It was the moment the world realized that a giant could fall.
$613 billion. Let that number hang in the air for a moment. This was the staggering amount of debt Lehman Brothers carried into bankruptcy. Against this massive mountain of liabilities, they held only $639 billion in assets, and many of those were deeply toxic, plunging in value by the hour. Overnight, it became the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. In an instant, 25,000 people around the world were left without a job, sending a shockwave that would soon carry a very real, devastating impact into the homes of everyday taxpayers.
Part 1. The Roots of the Crisis, and a Century of Regulation and Rollbacks.
You see, a catastrophe of this magnitude doesn't just materialize out of thin air. It's the result of decades of shifting political winds, deliberate legislative choices, and the slow erosion of barriers that were originally built to keep the system safe. Following the devastation of the Great Depression, the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act was passed to prevent commercial banks from gambling with depositors' money in the stock market. For decades, those barriers held. But by 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act tore down the wall between commercial and investment banking. And just 1 year later, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000 entirely exempted complex financial instruments, derivatives, from federal oversight. This set the stage for a $600 trillion derivatives market to operate largely in the shadows. The guards had essentially been removed from the gates.
Part 2. The Lehman Moment. Panic and Contagion. When the housing market bottomed out in 2007, toxic subprime mortgages spread a sickness across the globe. By 2008, the panic was palpable. But it leaves us with the defining question of the era. Just months prior, in March 2008, the government engineered a rescue of another massive investment bank, Bear Stearns. So why was Bear Stearns saved from the brink, while Lehman Brothers was left to fail completely alone? The answer lies in the brutal difference between two financial realities. Bear Stearns suffered a liquidity crisis. Their assets still held reasonable value, but they simply lacked the cash on hand to operate. Lehman Brothers, however, faced a solvency crisis. As officials from the FDIC later explained, Lehman's debts completely dwarfed the true value of its assets. Under the law, the Federal Reserve was strictly prohibited from extending loans to an institution that was completely irredeemably insolvent. Yet historians and economists still argue that this inconsistent response from Washington, saving one, destroying another, only poured gasoline on the fire of global panic. The panic was instantaneous. The sheer terror of contagion gripped the government. In a devastating irony, just 24 hours after allowing Lehman to die, the Federal Reserve panicked at the spreading wreckage. They reversed course entirely. They injected a staggering $85 billion of taxpayer money to save the insurance giant AIG, absolutely terrified that a second collapse would completely obliterate the global economy. The damage, however, was already done. The collapse of Lehman was a true economic earthquake. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which stood at a robust 14,164 points in October 2007, was utterly decimated. By March 2009, 6 months after the Lehman bankruptcy, the Dow had lost more than half its value, cratering to 6,594 points. And the contagion didn't stop at the American border. It spread across the ocean, igniting sovereign debt crises that would eventually bring nations like Greece, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal to their knees. Part 3. The Dodd-Frank Overhaul, Redrawing the Rules of Wall Street. From the ashes of this unprecedented destruction, a response was demanded. The U.S. government realized the fundamental architecture of Wall Street had to be entirely redrawn. In July 2010, President Barack Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Act. It was the most sweeping, complex financial reform since the Great Depression. It introduced a new alphabet soup of regulatory guardians. The Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FASOC, was created to monitor systemic risk, to look for the next Lehman before it was too late. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was established to shield ordinary Americans from predatory lending. The FDIC was granted expanded authority to safely dismantle failing financial giants in an orderly liquidation, specifically to end the era of institutions being too big to fail. And finally, the Federal Reserve mandated rigorous annual stress tests to ensure large banks actually had the strength to survive another crisis. Perhaps the most fiercely contested pillar of this overhaul was the Volcker Rule, named after former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. This mandate strictly forbade banks from making speculative investments, like proprietary trading or operating hedge funds using their own accounts. Volcker's logic was heavy but simple. Financial institutions that benefit from government protections and taxpayer subsidies should never be allowed to gamble those funds for their own profit.
The new laws also took direct aim at the perilous leverage that doomed Lehman. Before the crisis, banks were operating at terrifying ratios, borrowing $30 for every single dollar they actually held in equity. Dodd-Frank forced a retreat from the cliff's edge. It empowered the Fed to impose a strict 15-to-1 leverage ratio, severely restricting the amount of borrowed money large banks could play with and forcing them to hold substantially more capital in reserve.
Part 4. Rollbacks and Regional Collapses. The debate reopens. But in Washington, legislation is rarely written in stone. As the memory of the 2008 panic began to fade, a new debate emerged. Critics argued that the heavy hand of Dodd-Frank was suffocating economic growth. A decade later, the political pendulum swung back. In 2018, Congress and the Trump administration signed a rollback designed to ease the burden on regional and mid-sized banks. Originally, Dodd-Frank mandated that any bank with $50 billion in assets must undergo strict annual stress tests. The 2018 rollback quintupled that threshold to $250 billion, while also exempting smaller banks from the strictures of the Volcker Rule. Proponents argued it would free up capital for lending. Opponents warned it was inviting the ghosts of 2008 back into the system. 5 years later, the warnings of fragility were violently realized. In March 2023, the financial world shook again. Silicon Valley Bank, the 16th largest bank in the United States, collapsed suddenly, becoming the third largest failure in American history. Days later, Signature Bank followed, marking the fourth largest failure. Once again, the Federal Reserve was forced to step in with an emergency rescue to protect depositors and prevent contagion. The sudden death of these regional giants immediately reignited the bitter war over regulation. The battle lines remain sharply drawn today. Supporters of strict oversight argue that robust rules are the only defense against another devastating crash, pointing to the 2018 rollbacks as the clear cause of the 2023 failures. Conversely, critics maintain that American banks are losing their global competitiveness under excessive, stifling regulations. They argue that Silicon Valley Bank was fundamentally flawed and destined to fail regardless of the stress test thresholds. Part 5. An unfinished regulatory debate and the legacy of Lehman. We arrive at last to the present day. We're left looking back at a landscape permanently scarred by the events of 2008. The term Lehman moment is now permanently etched into the global financial vocabulary. It's a dark shorthand for a sudden, catastrophic collapse driven by blind systemic risk. Consider the weight of this foundational truth. There is no institution immune enough against its own greed. A company born from a single horse-drawn carriage in Alabama in 1850, a firm that weathered a century and a half of global turmoil, was eventually erased because it placed a blind bet that the American housing market would never fall. It's a sobering testament to the fact that when an empire places its faith purely in relentless expansion, ignoring the boundaries of risk, it seals its own tomb. Which brings us to the present reality. With decades of regulations, rollbacks, and regional collapses behind us, we are forced to ask, are our financial systems truly safe today, or are we simply waiting for the next Lehman moment?